Hello and welcome to another poetry analysis in which I will be going through for GCSE English Literature for the AQA exam board the poem Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. First I'll read the poem, then I'll give some background on the author Ted Hughes, and then I'll go through an analysis of the poem. So first, the poem itself, Bayonet Charge. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle, numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the center of his chest. In bewilderment then he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honor, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. So now I will give some background on the author Ted Hughes. So he was born in the year 1930, after the First World War. However, his poem is thought to have been based off of a battle in the First World War. His influence could have been from his father, who had participated in the war, and also from his city of where he was raised, in which the entire community was heavily affected by the war. This poem in particular is thought to have been inspired by Wilfred Owen's poem Spring Offensive, in which Owen also describes a soldier with a bayonet thinking about how and why, what the reason is for his partaking in the war. So now I'll begin an analysis, and before this I'd like to point out that this is a sheet, a blank template produced by head of English Mr. Davies, who has allowed one to split the poem up into 6 key points. So these are themes, language, structure, context, connections, and interpretations. And also keep in mind that when answering a question, you must always mention effect, because by adding the effect to each quote, the effect on the reader or the effect on a contemporary or modern audience is what could make the difference between a low grade and a high grade answer. So now I'll begin with the themes of the poem. So I'll begin with how this poem shows the effects of war on the soldier himself, shown by the final line, his terror's touchy dynamite. This could perhaps be describing the PTSD of the soldier after they've experienced an incredibly traumatic event in their wartime. However, a more profound theme could be the indescribable horror of war. So in the first and second line, how he repeats raw seamed hot khaki. The repetition of a simple word shows how indescribable it is, and how he has to repeat the word and revert to a more simple vocabulary to just show the immense effects and horrors of war. So now I'll be moving on to an analysis of language. So as I said, raw seamed hot khaki. This is a repetition of raw, not only showing the indescribable horror of war, but also perhaps showing the lack of sophistication of the soldier's actions, how he's repeating himself, stumbling over himself. Next, we have a symbolism of being hunted, shown by the yellow hair at the start of the third stanza. So this yellow hair could perhaps be the soldier himself that has been attacked by the enemy and is threshing in a circle. It's been attacked And the yellow hair also is a reference to nature, again showing how war not only affects people, horror of war not only affects people, but also it affects nature in an irreversible manner. Next we have this quite heavy quote, which is a metaphor and also simile, and also gives a hellish imagery. So we have the patriotic tear swelling in his eye like molten iron from his chest. So the patriotic tear swelling in his eye, that could perhaps show his patriotism that he had kept inside him is now leaving his body like molten iron from his chest. The molten iron could perhaps suggest a kind of mechanical feel of a soldier who've all been conditioned to work as one and waste no actions. And in addition, molten iron is hellish imagery. It appears as if molten iron is sweating out from his chest, it's coming out from him. Again, perhaps describing soldiers as just robots, machines of destruction. And next we have a metaphor and alliteration in the second stanza. In what cold clockwork of the stars and nations was he the hand pointing at second? The metaphor of the cold clockwork of the stars could perhaps be influenced by his interest in astrology, and also the alliteration of cold clockwork, the harsh sound of k, the cold clockwork, showing how he's being used as just a single cog in the infinite time, in the infinite fate of the universe. And next, in the third stanza, we have what appears to be a dismissive / mocking tone by etc. How he's listing king, honor, human dignity, all aspects of a soldier that they would want to protect, but then followed by the word etc. and then dropped like luxuries, shows that in the face of danger, a soldier would not care for his king, for his country, but is more likely to have a will to stay alive and to just survive the war. And next we have the alliterative metaphor at the end of the poem, his terror's touchy dynamite. So the metaphor of his terror's touchy dynamite could perhaps show how he's been permanently affected by the war, having seen this hair literally burn alive from the head. And in addition, the alliteration further emphasizes the complete terror that he feels from war. The poem begins with the adverb suddenly, which creates an in medias res. In medias res is a Latin term in which can be used as a terminology how the poem starts in the action. Suddenly he awoke. So as soon as the poem starts, you're being brought straight into the action. And next, in the first stanza, there is a huge repertoire of violent words used by Ted Hughes. Things like raw, heavy, smashed, smacked, lugged. All these violent verbs particularly, which show the complete brutality of war. And next we have alliteration in the first line, running raw. So this alliteration shows how he was unprepared, raw as in like unprepared food. He is not ready to go into war, but he's still running towards it. Next we have a simile in the second stanza, like a man who has jumped up in the dark. The abstract noun of dark, how he's jumped up in the dark, shows that the man is in the unknown. He does not know what's happening. And he's in the second stanza where he's completely questioning his reason of being in the war. And the final piece of language is an image and also a symbolism of him stumbling across a field of clods. The image of him stumbling shows his lack of control and could also essentially symbolize perhaps clods being an ambiguous word for masses of dirt that could perhaps also be dead bodies which have gone unnoticed, which cover the ground. So now I will move on to a structure analysis of the poem. So starting off with the smaller scale structure, we have multiple caesurae through the poem. So, for example, in the second stanza, was he the hand pointing that second? A caesura is a pause in the middle of the line, which forces the reader to stop and also to reflect, which could perhaps put the reader in the shoes of the soldier and allow them to sympathize with him, and allow them to reflect and also think about the reason as to why soldiers go to war. Furthermore, through the poem, there is a enjambment where the line or a sentence runs on through multiple lines. So an example of this is again in the second stanza, for the reason of his still running. This enjambment shows a lack of control and can also show the horror of war, how it's a continuous thing. Next, on a larger scale, the poem has no rhyme scheme, so there's no rhyme at the end of the lines, and it is also written in free verse. It has no meter for the stressed slash unstressed syllables of the poem. In addition, the poem is written in the third person, so that shows a somewhat detached view of war or of society. Which could perhaps show how Ted Hughes, because he did not experience a war, he is unable to express the feelings of war through the first person. Next, looking at a somewhat summary of the poem. In the first and third stanza, there's action, so he was running and he plunged past. However, the second stanza is slow and he's contemplating his reason. In bewilderment, he almost stopped. Next is a brief overview of context. So, as I said before, Wilfred Owen was influenced. I apologize. Ted Hughes was influenced by the poet Wilfred Owen, who was in the First World War and wrote poems about his experience, about how the horrors of war had affected him and his friends in the trenches. And we see mirroring of Wilfred Owen's Spring Offensive in Ted Hughes' poem. So, for example, the repetition of raw in the first two lines, and also the use of the word plunged past. This could show how he's taken inspiration from Wilfred Owen's poem. And again, his father served in the First World War, and also his hometown, based in Lancashire, was heavily affected by the war. Next, we'll move on to connections. So, Bayonet Charge can compare with quite a few poems, so it can be used to compare with the effects of conflicts, so it can be used to compare with the poems like Charge of the Light Brigade, or Remains, or Exposure. So, for example, with Charge of the Light Brigade in particular, in Charge of the Light Brigade, There's Not a Reason Why, contrasts with Was he the hand pointing that second. In Charge of the Light Brigade, the soldiers have been conditioned and are not allowed to think for themselves, whereas in Bayonet Charge, the soldier, in the midst of battle, has stopped and is now contemplating his reason as to why he's fighting. Furthermore, Bayonet Charge can also be used to talk about a lack of power. So, for example, in the first stanza, he lugged his rifle numb as a smashed arm. His rifle has become one with his body and is now just a burden. It's useless now. And ending the poem with his terror's touchy dynamite, how he's been permanently affected by the war. This poem also contains imagery of nature. So, for example, in the second stanza, the cold clockwork of the stars, or in the third stanza, how he goes towards the green hedge and how the yellow hair has been thrown up. All these references to nature and how they've been affected by war shows again the complete horror that soldiers would feel during war. And now, moving on to interpretations. Again, the indescribable horror of war is shown by the repetition of raw and also stumbling in a field of green clods. The soldier is unable to articulate himself and is stumbling over himself. He's unable to describe war. And it can also be shown as perhaps a soldier abandoning his duty, patriotic tear, how his patriotism, his love for his country is leaving him, and in the third stanza, king, honor, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries, how all of these, the things that a soldier should be fighting for, have been dropped in fear of death. And again, as a reminder, in an essay you always want to mention the effect of the quote on an audience. This is what will make a difference between a low grade and a high grade. So this has been an overview of Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. Please keep in mind that I have not analyzed every image in the poem as it is quite complex. Thank you for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I wish you all luck in your GCSEs.